Clementine looked around the vehicle until she looked to the driver's seat. Ever learn how to drive? Zeke asked. Clementine looked at him with a smirk. I'm 11, what do you think? Clementine said. Maybe yes, Zeke said as he returned the smirk. Clementine rolled her eyes and said, No, I never learned how to drive. Bummer, who knows? Maybe if we find a working vehicle, maybe one of the adults can teach you, Zeke said. I'll pass, Clementine said. She then looked down at the steering wheel and her eyes widened. Hey, the keys are still in the thing. She was referring to the ignition. Really? Well, let's see if it works, Zeke said. Clementine got up and sat down in the passenger seat while Zeke climbed into the driver's seat. Zeke turned the key, but the vehicle would not start. Out of gas, Pete muttered. Zeke huffed before it got out of the driver's side. He walked over to the compartment and checked for anything they could use. He found some cigarettes. All the memories of his abusive father came back to him. He remembered being 6 and pleading with his father to stop beating him. The man all would do was shout his mouth up before hitting him again. This was followed by his father walking away and puffing out his cigarette. Zeke, Clementine said. The boy snapped out of the flashbacks and turned to the girl. Is everything okay? The girl asked with a concerned look on his face. Yeah, Zeke said. Yeah, I just need to rest up. He got up and sat behind the driver's seat of the van. Zeke was still concerned. Clementine was still concerned. He seemed to be in his own world. He looked at the compartment where he was looking at and saw some cigarettes in there. What's in there? Anything we can use? Pete asked. Clementine got up and showed a box of cigarettes to Pete. Give me one of those, Pete said. Clementine approached Pete as Pete continued. Probably tastes like pine tar by now. Clementine then handed the box of cigarettes to Pete and Pete asked, You got a light? Clementine shook her head. Sorry, I would have brought one if I had known we were going to be stuck back out here. Pete huffed and looked to Zeke. Hey Zeke, you got a light? Zeke walked over to Pete. He seemed okay at first, but the horrified look found its way onto his face. Zeke? Clementine asked. Zeke shook his head and he said, Yeah, he said. He took out his lighter from his backpack and slid it over to Pete and Clementine. Pete picked up the lighter and lit the cigarette. He coughed out some smoke before he said, Well, that just tastes as bad as I thought it would. Clementine looked over at Zeke before she looked at Pete. Do you think Zeke's okay? Pete looked over at the boy and looked at Clementine. I don't think so. Maybe you should go talk to him. We'll be waiting here for a while, Pete said. Clementine looked up and walked over to the teenager. Zeke? Clementine said. The teenager looked with a shocked expression stare before he released a breath. My gosh, something's wrong with me. Clementine sat down next to him and put a comforting hand on his back. Do you want to talk about it? It might feel better if you do. I didn't grow up in a loving household. You don't know me all that well. But I usually try to be sarcastic and positive so I could just forget everything. Forget about my childhood, Zeke said. What happened? Clementine asked. My father was an abusive drunkard. We lived in a shack house in the middle of the woods. He would go drinking all day while Decker and I went to school. The only way we got money was from my mom. I guess she wasn't completely heartless, Zeke explained. Where was your mom? Clementine asked. She left to climb the corporate ladder, to get ahead in her career, Zeke said. She would send me some money to me and Decker, but that wasn't enough. My dad, if you ever want to call him that, couldn't hold down his own job with his heavy drinking and smoking habits. I'm sorry, Zeke, Clementine said. She hugged the boy in an attempt to comfort him. He scoffed as he returned the hug. You're very friendly, Zeke said. I feel kind of guilty. I only grew up being an only child. My mom and dad coddled me to no end. Then Lee took care of me, and when he was gone, I was immediately taken to house where Rebecca and Alvin adopted me a few months ago. Clementine said, You and your brother didn't have anyone. My brother had me for what it was worth, Zeke said. I had Krista and Omid for a while. I was pretty far cold after I lost Decker. I understand, Clementine said. She released Zeke from the hug and then looked around the van. What do we do now? Clementine asked. Pete took another whiff of the cigarette and said, Now we wait, Pete replied. Clementine sat next to Zeke and hugged her legs. Pete was right. All they could do was just wait for the herd outside to lose interest, or better yet, wait for a rescue to arrive. Her thoughts were interrupted when Pete said, "Zeke, come here." Zeke huffled before he made his way over. He didn't seem to be on edge as he was earlier. Pete whispered something into his ear, which made the boy jump back. "You can't be serious." "I am. You gotta keep Clem safe. There are not that many people like her left in this world, and you can't let her die here," Pete said. Zeke sighed and said, "What about Nick? He'll be fine. The boy has to grow up at some point," Pete said. "Pete, are you asking me to do the insane? Just think about this," Zeke said. My mind is made up," Pete said. "Zeke," he huffled before muttering. "Okay." Zeke went over back to Clementine. "What was Dad all about?" Clementine asked. Zeke didn't respond until a few minutes later. "Try and get some rest. We're going to be moving out as soon as that herd outside clears up." "What about Pete?" Clementine asked. "Keeping you safe is what he wants," Zeke replied. Clementine's eyes widened and she said, "You're gonna leave him here, are you?" "Clem, there's not much I can do. I can't carry him," Zeke said. "No, I'm not leaving my friend," Clementine said. "I've lost so many friends already. I'm not losing another." Zeke didn't respond. He just leaned back and closed his eyes. Clementine looked at Pete with tears streaming down from her eyes. She really didn't want to leave him. Eventually, since she leaned onto Zeke and fell asleep as well. A cough woke up Zeke. He looked around and noticed it was nighttime. The van was dimly lit by the stars and the moon from outside. Zeke looked over to Pete, who was on his side. The coughing continued. Zeke nudged Clementine awake. The girl yawned before rubbing her eyes. Zeke got up and went towards Pete. He pulled down an arrow from the quiver and aimed the bow at Pete. "Pete, you still there?" Zeke said. Pete groaned before he looked up at Zeke. He was even more paler than before. In addition, there was blood around his mouth and chin. "I feel like 10 pounds of shit in a 5-pound sack," Pete muttered. Zeke placed an arrow back into its quiver before going outside. It seemed that the herd has dispersed. "It looks like it's clear," Zeke said. "Then what are you waiting for? Go," Pete said. "What about you?" Clementine asked. "You're coming with us." Pete looked back and shook his head. "This is the end of the line for me, Clem," Pete said. "No, you have to come. We can't just leave you to die," Clementine said. "Clementine, you're a good kid. Very compassionate, but I'm not going to put you or Zeke in danger. I don't have much left in me. You're just gonna have to go," Pete said. "Clem's right. Pete's right," Zeke said. Clementine looked before she nudged at the older man. She whimpered a bit as the older man returned the hug. "It's okay. You stay safe. You listen to Zeke until you get back." The two separated from the hug as the girl rubbed her eyes and nodded her head in response. Clementine inched her way over to Zeke, and Zeke took his backpack off and pulled out a handgun. He gave it to Pete and said, "It's up to you if you want to use it." Pete nodded and said, "Keep Clem safe." "I will," Zeke said. He opened the back door of the van and climbed out, and Clementine followed him. Zeke took the young girl's hand and tried to sneak around the walkers, but to no avail. The walkers noticed them immediately. "Run!" Zeke whispered. He ran with Clementine. The younger girl was able to keep up with him rather well. They kept running throughout the rest of the night. Zeke and Clementine ran back to the door of the cabin and huffed as they catched their breaths. "You okay?" Zeke asked. "Yeah," Clementine said between huffs. Zeke looked at the back door and said, "All right, well, we're in for a shitstorm." "Swear," Clementine said. Zeke rolled his eyes before he grabbed the doorknob and turned it. He stepped inside with Clementine following him. The teenage boy and the child turned the table up to see Rebecca and Carlos at the table. Rebecca got up and ran to Clementine. She hugged the girl and asked, "Are you okay? What happened?" "I'm okay," Clementine said. "What happened?" Carlos inquired. "Where's Pete and Nick?" He seemed very annoyed. "It's been hours. Where are they?" "Walkers separated us," Zeke said. "We were down by the river, but there were tons of bodies there." Rebecca separated from Clementine as she turned to Zeke. "Luke and Alvin went to look for you. Did you see them?" Zeke shook his head, and he said, "Pete, Clem, and I have been stuck in a van for half a day." "Oh no," Rebecca said. "That high body count must have been caused by Carver," Carlos said. You must have brought him here. You kidding? I don't ally with psychopaths, Zeke said. We need to go out there, Rebecca said to Carlos. She sounded more determined and serious than usual. Just hold on, Carlos said. My husband's out there, Rebecca exclaimed in panic. Get the guns. Carlos clenched his teeth before walking off into the living room. Alvin and Luke went to looking for you. I would have gone, but I didn't want to leave Genevieve, Rebecca said. Then she turned to Zeke and said, Listen, thank you for looking after my daughter, but I need you to be in charge until we get back. Don't worry, I'll hold down the fort, Zeke said. Thank you, Rebecca said. Do you have to go, Mommy? Clementine asked. I just got back. I know, baby, but Daddy's still out there. I have to find him along with Luke and Nick, Rebecca said. Okay, Clementine said as she lowered her head. She was not happy that her adoptive mother was going out there. Rebecca kissed the girl on the head before she stood upright. Carlos returned to the guns and handed a gun to Rebecca, and the two stared at the door. However, Carlos turned around and addressed Zeke. Stay away from Sarah, Carlos said with a scowl on his face. Zeke crossed his arms over his chest and said, How about you should let her make your own decisions for once? Carlos shook his head and went outside to help with the search. He slammed the door behind him, which made Clementine shudder. He really doesn't like you, Clementine said. Good. Yeah, I know, Zeke said. He turned to the girl and said, Let's go find Sarah. I imagine Jen is not up yet. Okay, Clementine said. She followed behind Zeke as they left the kitchen and went upstairs to find Sarah. Once they entered her room, they quickly caught a glance of her holding a camera. Say cheese, Sarah said, before a flash of bright light blinded Zeke and Clementine. It startled them for a second, but their eyes quickly adjusted to the flash. Once their eyes had just adjusted, they saw Sarah pull out a picture from the camera. The camera itself looked very old. Where did you find this dinosaur? Zeke joked. Sarah giggled and said, I found it under the house. There was a lot of neat stuff down there. She handed the camera to Zeke and she said, Here, take a picture of me and Clem, please. All right, Zeke said as he accepted the camera. Clementine smiled before she ran over and joined Sarah. Say cheese, Sarah and Clementine said. Zeke then took the picture and lowered the camera and pulled out the photo. Hey, where's my dad? Sarah asked. He'll be back, Sarah, Clementine said. The teenager looked inside. He's doing it again, isn't he? Being overprotective? Zeke nodded and said, You need to know what's going on out there. Sarah looked up at him and was shocked. I don't know if you should. My dad may not let me see you again. He may force you to leave, Zeke said. Sarah said. Sarah, you need to know this. You don't have to tell your dad, but you do need to know what's going on, Zeke said. Clementine stayed silent, as she knew that Zeke was right. Okay, what do I need to know? Sarah said. First, there's walking corpses out there. There used to be normal people, but the virus has gotten into them for one way or another. You could become one of them if you're bit or die and your brain is intact. Second, people are very dangerous. If you don't know the person, then they're likely that person that will try to hurt you, Zeke explained. Given the circumstances, Sarah was taking it well. She did cringe a bit, but it was understandable. Okay, anything else? Sarah asked. Yeah, you'll need to know how to use a gun, Zeke said. Okay, I actually found a gun under the house. There's no bullets in it, Sarah said. That'll work. Go ahead and get it, Zeke said. I'm going to check on Jen. He then walked off of Clementine, following close behind. He checked on Rebecca and Alvin's room to see the toddler playing with some of the blocks. I'll play with her for a little while you teach Sarah, Clementine said. Okay, if she come get me if she gets hungry, starts crying, or needs to be changed, Zeke said. Okay, Clementine said. She walked over into the room and sat in front of Genevieve. Zeke left the room and went to find Sarah. He found her looking for the nightstand. She pulled out a handgun and showed it to Zeke. Here it is. I'm a little nervous and excited, Sarah said. That's normal, Zeke said. He got behind her, raised his arms up. Zeke could tell that she was a tad bit taller than her. He helped her get a good grip on the gun. There should be a way you should shoot. We'll get some practice in some of the point down the road. Cool. If I feel good about this, Sarah said. She turned around with the gun and she asked, "What do I shoot first?" Zeke dived into the ground to avoid the gun's aim. He looked up with her with a curious look on his face. "Sorry," Sarah said as she lowered the gun. Zeke sighed and he got up. "It's fine. Just don't aim it at anything unless you want to kill someone. I will warn you, the first kill is always going to be the hardest," Zeke said. "You won't be ready for it." "I don't know if I want to do this anymore," Sarah said. "You have to, Sarah. It's how we survive," Zeke said. Sarah nodded and she said, "Where's Clem?" "She's looking after Jen," Zeke said. "Oh, okay," Sarah said as she paused for a few moments before she said, "So, do you like me?"